right, good afternoon, everyone. Is this someone's cell phone? Okay. Okay, thank you. So we're going straight into our keynote address, and I'm delighted to be introducing this afternoon Darrin Lunde. Darrin is the collection manager of the Division of Mammals at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And for those of you that don't know, that's part of the Smithsonian. And the reason why that's important and it's particularly relevant, it was because the year that Theodore Roosevelt went to Africa in 1909 and killed quite a few specimens, all of those specimens went to either the Museum of Natural History in New York or it was for the foundation, in fact, of the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. That was the foundation year. I believe it was 1910 when it opened. And so this is a great opportunity to speak to Darrin about a topic that I know is close to his research interests. I read Darrin Lunde's book, The Naturalist, a good few years ago now when it came out, but with great interest because for me, what I think about, one of the reasons why Roosevelt is so instrumental to conservation and sustainability is because he grew up in an era where conservation was being professionalized. And I mean, the very study of things like birds and animals was becoming professionalized. And he was part of that movement that founded groups like the Boone and Crockett Society. We've talked about other clubs as well, but even the very idea of science was changing with 2 years before he was born. The Origins of Species came out, which was, of course, the doctrine of evolution and Charles Darwin's thought, which transformed not only science, but social sciences as well. So it's critically important. And there's no better book out there, actually, on this subject of the wider context, as well as Theodore Roosevelt's place in that context, than Darrin's book, The Naturalist. More recently, I have read Darrin's work in the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal. He's now writing a column for that journal. And I think for people of North Dakota, you'll be interested to know the last journal had a wonderful article about the elkhorn and the name for the elkhorn. And I believe in the Smithsonian there is a specimen of two intertwined elk's horns that have given, that we believe gave the name to the Elkhorn Ranch. So I would encourage you to talk to Darrin about that at some stage as well, and keep your eye out for future journal articles that he'll be writing. What I did not expect to be speaking to you tonight about was poop. Yep, that's right, poop. Darrin has written a book about poop. He is a prolific author of children's books, one of which is called Whose Poop Is That? Or something along those lines. As you can imagine, it's a big hit with the kids who love to talk about poop. And feel free to ask him questions tonight about poop. But in all seriousness, Darrin's interest in mammals and science is it's inspirational. And I think it naturally leads into a lot of our everyday experiences, as you can tell by the work that he does with his children's books. But also, I think his general ethos for teaching everyone is very much about making science accessible and everyday. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Darrin Lunde.
Thank you, Michael. It's really great to be back here at Dickinson State University. Oh, is it on? Maybe I'm a little taller. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. It's great to be back here at Dickinson State University. A little bit louder? All right, I'll try to. Maybe I should. How's that? I tend to walk around, so I may just grab this mic and talk. No? Why don't we do it that way? Why don't we do it this way? Is that okay? We'll get this right. How's that? This is going to be a little bit of a different talk from the last session. Where's my slide advance? How do I go back? Red. I'm giving it all. Are we there yet? Are we good now with audio? And I'm going to move around, so I can't lean in on that thing. Okay, so shortly after leaving the White House in the spring of 1909, Theodore Roosevelt and his son Kermit embarked on the Smithsonian Roosevelt East African expedition. Joined by 3 scientists, they spent 9 months hunting and collecting zoological specimens throughout Kenya, Uganda, and what is now South Sudan. The expedition secured hundreds of big game animals and thousands more birds and small mammals, all of which are still housed in the scientific collections of the Smithsonian today. Taken together, Roosevelt specimens serve to document the East African fauna as it existed before its recent transformation. Unfortunately, the expedition is often remembered as little more than a big game hunting trip, and a particularly bloody one at that. Anytime someone brings up the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition, it's this picture on the left. It's Roosevelt with a rifle and a dead animal, and you got your pick of an elephant, you have a buffalo, there are several famous, well-known pictures of him with rhinos. That's the perception. That's what everyone thinks when they think of the Smithsonian safari. Rarely does anyone consider the extent to which Roosevelt collected specimens for science. That would be the picture on the right, which is from within the collections of the Smithsonian Institution. And if you don't recognize it, those are 2 elephant skulls, which Roosevelt himself collected, and which he ensured and insisted on getting back to the Smithsonian. Not just the skulls, but also the skins, the tusks, and in some cases, the full skeleton of elephants, which required his expedition to, number 1, carry those things around for 9 months while he was moving to his next venue. But think about it. You know, he shot more than 1 elephant. I can't remember exactly how many. It's less than, it's about 6 or 7. And they had to prepare those in the field, they had to carry them around, they had to collect data from them, and they had to ship them all the way back to the Smithsonian, specifically because Roosevelt was dedicated to science. From his earliest years, Roosevelt understood the value of scientific collections. And it's often overlooked, but that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. All right. 3 things you need to know about a scientific specimen or scientific collections. Number 1, they're not for public display. Never intended for the public to see them. It's kind of the reason why no one knows about them. But they're not for public display. Number 2, they're vast. When you go to a natural history museum, you'll see hundreds of specimens on exhibit. But when you get behind the scenes, depending on what kind of animal it is, it's going to be thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of individual animals. So think of the Theodore Roosevelt Center with all of its, Susan was just telling me she just acquired 85 pounds of documents. You know, you think of all of the documents and the artifacts that are housed in archives. Think of a museum as an archive, except it's physical specimens of animals. So they're not for the public, they're vast, and they serve as our record of life on Earth. They are the physical evidence of, it's the beginning of everything we know about natural history. It has to be based on something. Yes, you could observe these things, but there's nothing like having that physical evidence. And that's what these scientific collections are for, and they are housed in natural history museums that you go and unsuspecting, you're looking at your dinosaurs, whether it's the Utah Museum, which we just saw, or any other museum. Upstairs, in the basement, behind that weird door somewhere, there are scientific collections. I should talk a little bit about what's on these slides. So to the left is a shrew that I collected in South Sudan. It's a whole shrew. It's a tiny little mammal, and it's completely intact. And it's in a jar of ethanol, and it exists in the collections, and people come and want to look at it. I look at it. Another type of specimen is what you see in the middle here, which are these dried, they look like voles, dried rodent skins, and their skulls, which are in those little vials. And you could see they're in drawers, and just imagine, you know, going upstairs in a museum and literally thousands and thousands of drawers like this, just full of dead animals. And you know, that's what you see. What I see is I see data. Because if you look at every one of those specimens, you see they have a tag on them with a number and with some data. Every one of those thousands of specimens is a data point. We know exactly when it was collected, we know where it was collected, we know, we have measurements, we have all kinds of data that was collected at the time of capture. And it's information, and it's stored in a very organized way so that you could go to a drawer that represents a geographic location for a specific species, and you could gather up this information. On the right is still yet another kind of museum preparation. These were actually collected by Roosevelt, all of these. They're mountain lions from Colorado. Again, in the Smithsonian, pull out the drawer, there they are. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these particular specimens a little later on in the talk, because there's a particular story that goes along with them. But that gives you a flavor of, and by the way, you know, these skins, they're the actual animal, but they're stuffed. You know, they're taxidermy. There's like cotton in there. They're stuffed. And the whole idea is to have the animal so that you could see it. You could see its external features. You could see its bones. You could see its skulls. All of that has information that helps us distinguish these species, which are always very hard to tell apart. It's not like identifying a lot of birds where you could look at it and you could see an obvious color pattern and you could say, oh, that's a such and such, or, you know, that's a cardinal, that's a bluebird. With these rodents, it's really tough, and you really need to scrutinize them, and you really need these specimens to understand the species. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about some of Roosevelt's work with these individual specimens. Okay. Now, I need to talk just a little bit about myself. And I should say that I'm not really a historian. I'm much more of a scientist. And for the past 35 years, I have worked for the two largest natural history collections in the world. That would be the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where I worked from 1991 until 2010, when I moved to the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. So between these two museums, it's not quite 1 million specimens, but there are 1 million specimens of mammals alone. If you were to look at something like insects, which are much smaller and much easier to collect, it's going to be measured in many, many millions of specimens. But my specialization is in mammals. And mammals are big, they're hard to get, they're hard to store, so we don't get as many of them. But 1 million mammals is a lot of mammals. And someone has to take care of those specimens. He has to physically take care of those specimens, but also needs to make sure that those specimens, like any other kind of archive, need to make sure that they're available for researchers. On any given day, I have 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7, sometimes 10, sometimes 12, sometimes more scientists coming in that have appointments that I want to look at the elephants, or I want to look at this, or I want to look at that. Schedule appointments, have them come in, and they go through and they're looking at these specimens. So someone has to take care of them, someone has to make sure that they're available as a resource. And this is a little bit of a controversial slide, and I selected these pictures deliberately because where do all these specimens come from? How did they get into this museum? And the truth of it is they were gathered over the course of the past 150 years. And they were gathered by people going out on expeditions with traps, with guns, with nets, specifically to collect them for the purpose of putting them into these collections. And a big part of my work the past 35 years with these two museums has involved joining or leading museum expeditions to really remote areas all around the world for the purpose of doing what's called biodiversity survey, which is we're not just going and killing animals and putting them in the museum like so much loot. What we're doing is we're traveling to remote and little-known parts of the world for the purpose of, the world isn't explored. Zoologically, it's not explored. There are a lot of things that we don't know. There are a lot of new species are being described every year. I've described some of them. We're constantly going out into very remote areas, looking to document the diversity of life, and we do that by collecting these specimens. These are not holiday tours. There's no tour guide. There are no amenities in the field. It's camping, and it's, I was adding it up this morning in the hotel. It's like, how long have I been in the field? And it's something like 4 years of my life has been spent living in a tent, or sometimes not even in a tent. I spent a full 9 months in the Amazon just living out of a hammock without even a tent or anything. And it's getting into these areas, and I've worked all over South America, Peru, French Guiana, all straight across Central Africa, Uganda, Kenya, South Sudan, Central African Republic, all over Southeast Asia. And it's what I do, and I specifically chose these pictures because, remember that picture of Roosevelt with the elephant and the gun? Immediately you think, he's a hunter, he's a big game hunter, he's a trophy. No, he's a collector, he's a museum collector. These are the tools that we use to do our job. Now, I'll admit, in recent years it's gotten harder and harder and harder to use guns in the field, and we're mostly trapping these things. But this gives you a flavor for what this kind of work is like. And you'll see that it's not really all that different from what Roosevelt was doing on the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition. I should also add that key to all of these efforts is the fact that we're collecting a wealth of information, a wealth of data with each specimen. In Roosevelt's time, what he did is he would collect the specimen, he would record where he got it exactly, he would record the date, he would take measurements of the specimen, they would take photographs, they would stand on top of their horses so they could get top-down views of their animals, they would fully document everything. But that's nothing compared to what we do today, where we have a whole protocol of we're going in and we're taking all kinds of DNA samples and tissue samples and liquid nitrogen and blood smears and all of this sort of medically related stuff that we're doing with these specimens. So I'm driving home the point that this is how these collections are made. It's done with purpose. Data is collected, and you get the idea. Now, for an important disclaimer. I want to make it very clear that I'm not here to officially represent any museum. Rather, it's my perspective, okay? It's my perspective as a museum man that I have to offer you today. There's very few people that do this work, maybe certainly less than 100 people in the world that do this seriously. It's probably less than 50 that really do it well. Nobody knows about this stuff, and it's not surprising to me that nobody appreciates this side of Roosevelt's life, or can even grasp, even if it's explained to them, as I've explained to people in my family. No, Roosevelt was a museum guy, he was collecting. They just see a hunter, they just see a big game hunter. But what I have to offer is perspective as a museum man, and I hope to use my background in natural history museums to help you better understand this important side of Roosevelt. I hope to really open your eyes to a side of him that has been a real challenge for me to get people to appreciate. But I think it's significant to who he was and what his vision was for conservation and for sustainability. So let's talk about Roosevelt. Let's talk about Roosevelt and his life as a naturalist. This is New York City, the corner, the slide on the left, the corner of 20th Street and Broadway. And as hard as it is to believe, Roosevelt this is where Roosevelt decided he wanted to be a naturalist, right in the heart of New York City. He was just 7 years old. It's a well-known story. I'll tell it again briefly. He was 7 years old. He was walking along Broadway when something caught his eye. It was something splayed out in front of a marketplace. Well, it was a seal. It was a dead seal from the harbor, dead less than a day, and it was spread out on a board. I guess it was put out there, for shock value to attract customers to this marketplace. Well, it sure attracted, young 7-year-old Teddy Roosevelt, who was just fascinated with it. He ran home and got a measuring stick and came back and was like taking all kinds of notes on this thing. He was so fascinated with that dead animal, that seal, that he begged the shopkeeper to give him the body. He's 7 years old. Right. Well, so Roosevelt got his wish. He got that seal, and he cleaned the skull, and he used it to form something he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. It was in his bedroom. It was just a little museum, and there on the left is the actual skull. It's on display in the American Museum of Natural History today. But up until his discovery of that seal, Roosevelt was a sickly kid. He suffered from asthma. He suffered from a lot of other things. And he was trapped inside. The parents protected him. He didn't get out much. And he spent all his time reading books. And he was particularly drawn to books about animals, and he was drawn to books about adventure. And this main read series was, you see the guy with the pistol and the rifle and the boy hunters, and anything that combined the two, anything that combined natural history and animals and adventure like that was just fascinating for Roosevelt as a young child. But none of it seemed very real to him, that is, until he discovered that seal. Then it all started to, it all became real to Roosevelt in his mind. And his interest in natural history, it was not a passing fad. It was an everyday thing for years. He was fascinated with collecting and preserving specimens for his museum. He took taxidermy lessons. He took taxidermy lessons with John Bell, who was the assistant to Audubon. With the best in the business, he studied taxidermy, and he learned how to make animals for display, like that owl. The snowy owl is one of TR's, which he did as a child. He prepared that, but he also learned how to make proper museum study skins, which is that bird on the far right. And again, you'll see he was collecting data. He made up little tags that said Roosevelt Museum. And maybe you could squint and Roosevelt didn't have the best handwriting, but those are his original museum tags on that. I guess it's a purple finch there on the right. That he put in his museum. And like a good 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old museum curator, he kept a ledger book of all of the specimens he collected. You see the numbers on the side. Those are sequential numbers of the specimens he collected. What's there up top? There's a couple of skunks, a bunch of skunks up top. I'm reading the scientific names. There's some voles through the middle. There's another skunk, and then some bats at the bottom, and a squirrel. He was really, he was not fooling around. He was very serious about his natural history museum. Now, when I first learned this about Roosevelt, it really got my attention because I got my start in natural history in exactly the same way. That's me when I'm like 12 years old in New York, teaching myself taxidermy with that squirrel. And again, teaching myself how to do the proper museum specimens there on the right. And then just keeping a ledger book. And it's, who does this? Okay, I did it. It seemed perfectly natural to me. Roosevelt was certainly fine with this. His parents were okay with it. Well, the truth is, a lot of people that I work with in museums have this same origin story. Like a lot of us, we did this, and we find out that oh yeah, I was 7. Oh yeah, I was 8. Oh, I was like a latecomer at 12 doing this stuff. But you know, why do we do it? So I grew up in New York. I grew up in New York City. I wasn't in a downtown area like I was at the edges of the outer boroughs. But I grew up in New York where, for me, nature always seemed very far away. It always seemed something not real, like Roosevelt. He was reading about it. He's like, it didn't seem real until he found that seal. Suddenly it's like, whoa, this is real. And I remember taking my first trips with my family into the country, and I'm like, wait a minute. There are actually places where things are alive, you know, and where you could wander around and you could be by yourself and you could walk through the grass and you could find things, and it was so eye-opening. But yet from my perspective, nature was always something that was very tenuous. It was always something that could be taken away. It was always something that could not be there, and I think that's significant. And it's why I gravitated towards relating to nature with this sort of penchant for, I wanted to hold on to it. I wanted to have it. I wanted some evidence. I wanted something that I could go to when I was back in the city. And I think Roosevelt was the same way. It was a sense of, these things are going to be gone. They could be extinct. They could be, you know, shot out. They could be, who knows what. But it's this feeling of needing to document something that we know we can't take for granted, that we all share in common, all of us museum people. Eventually, I wrote a book. This was 8 years ago when I was here last, and gave a version of this talk. But I wrote a book on Roosevelt and his life as a naturalist. And he took many, many twists and turns in his evolution as a naturalist. I can't go through all of it in this talk. But one of the central themes of my book is how dedicated Roosevelt was through every single stage of his life. He was going back to his museum. He was collecting specimens. He was and wanted to be seen as a bona fide museum scientist. I know what a museum scientist is. I'm explaining to you what a museum scientist is. And I think it needs to get out there more so people understand this aspect of Roosevelt's life a little bit better. His early interest was probably helped along by the fact that Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was instrumental in the founding of the American Museum of Natural History. And so it was founded when he was 10 years old in his living room of his house. They signed the charter in 1869. That building on the left is the first building of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. The second, if you look at the top floor, the second dormered window, the little one, that was my old office, which I miss. But that's where all the scientific collections were. They were all on that top floor in those early days. Roosevelt was there to unpack the first specimens that were coming in. And then on the 4 floors below that were the public exhibits where everyone else got to go. So from a very early age, he understood what museums are about and the science that took place in them. And he tried to emulate the naturalists that he knew. And he got his best chance when the family took an extended tour through Egypt, just a holiday tour when he was 14. And he turned it into an expedition. It was his first time in Africa, and it became a bona fide museum expedition. He got to bring his gun, and if you read through his journals, every day he was out there shooting birds, stuffing birds, collecting birds. The specimen, the dried specimen on the right, is it's a slit-faced bat. It's a bat that Roosevelt collected in Egypt. And something else I want to point out is these collections in these museums, we're not the Roosevelt Museum. We don't have a Roosevelt collection. His specimens are in the scientific collection. This bat is in with all the other slit-faced bats from Egypt, collected by other people who were not famous. Roosevelt just happened to be someone that became famous. But his specimens, I mean, look at that. He was 14 years old, and he was shooting bats in Egypt, and he was stuffing them and tagging them on a catalog and donating them to the new American Museum. That's something remarkable, in my opinion. So he was so dedicated to this that his brothers and sisters hated him. You know, his sister said, anytime he comes in the room, I hear the word bird, or I hear the word skin. That's all he talks about. And his brother Elliot complained about the wash basin always being filled with guts of animals. And, you know, the family, to their credit, they tolerated it, they encouraged it. By the time he was done with his work in Egypt, he had collected, do you want to guess? He had collected, in his catalog, he was up to 1,495 specimens. 224 of those were mammals, like this bat. 931 of those were birds. That's impressive. Roosevelt went to Harvard intent on becoming a professional naturalist. He continued leading expeditions to the Adirondacks. He wrote scientific papers. There are two examples here. You can't quite read them, but they're basically lists of birds that he found. Some are birds in the Adirondacks, and he wrote lists of birds in Oyster Bay. And at that time, this was real information that wasn't known. You know, he followed the migrations of the birds. He kept notebooks. He really collected data on when they first appeared in Oyster Bay. He was the real deal. He went to Harvard, and he was intent on becoming something like a museum curator. Well, Roosevelt was quick to discover that the kind of naturalism that he liked, this adventurous getting out with his gun and collecting specimens, it was kind of just going out of style right when he was getting into it. What luck. It was the new biology. It came over from Europe, and it focused on laboratory science and empirical, you know, collecting data. And I mean, Roosevelt collected data, but it was really, read the quotes, which are from his autobiography. He felt there was a total failure to really understand good old natural history, getting out, making observations on animals that he saw in the wild. And why do we have to hunch over a microscope in a laboratory? He just didn't want to do it. And so famously, he abandoned any notion of becoming a naturalist. He was going to be his kind of naturalist or not a naturalist at all. So he was done with being a naturalist. He studied law, and you know, part of it was probably had a little something to do with his meeting Alice Lee, who was there on the left, who would be his first wife. She probably wasn't. She was a very refined young woman, and probably wasn't as tolerant of guts being left in wash basins, and so that probably figured into his decision. But suffice it to say that Roosevelt abandoned natural history and decided to study law and politics instead. But the naturalist in him never died. He could make that declaration, but it never died. And he found an outlet in big game hunting, which got him interacting with mammals in nature as a predator, and it had an element of adventure, which he always loved. And a number of speakers earlier on, you know, have mentioned it. His first hunt, he went out west to hunt buffalo, to quote, shoot a buffalo while there was still buffalo left to shoot. He was pretty brash, you know. He wasn't, he didn't have his conservation ethic at this point. He was going out west because he wanted to shoot one of the last of the buffalo that were out there. But he got enamored with the West, and so enamored that, and it's here, it's right where we are. This is where he came, you know, he came here, and was so enamored with the place that he got into the cattle business. He wanted to go into the business, but he also wanted a good excuse to get out west. Shortly afterwards, his first wife died on Valentine's Day, same day that his mother died. He was distraught, he was traumatized, and he came west. He came west and retreated deep into the western wilderness to hunt. And he spent weeks hunting in the remote Bighorn Mountains, and it was during this time that he was transformed into the hunter-naturalist that we know him as. He wanted to write popular books about animals, and he wanted to write about the adventure of his hunts. And the first The first of his books of this kind was Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, which really set him on course. It was a critical review of this book that he got from George Bird Grinnell, who was the founder of the Audubon Society. And together they famously found a similar society for mammals called the Boone and Crockett Club. And it was that interaction with Grinnell and that led to him developing his conservation ethic, which is that natural resources are not unlimited, they're not inexhaustible, and that there needs to be effective planning. And with effective planning, these resources could be sustainably managed for future generations. He went on to have an impressive political career, yet through every stage of his career, he was constantly still collecting specimens. Here are those mountain lion specimens that he collected. So the guy with the glasses, that's Clinton Hart Merriam, who was a respected mammologist. He was affiliated with the Smithsonian. He didn't really work for the Smithsonian. But Merriam was busy, splitting up the mountain lions into all kinds of subspecies. He was drawing these maps and looking at sort of ecological zones and saying, well, there's all of these species of mountain lions all over North America. And he was writing all of these formal signs. And Roosevelt was looking at it like this and saying, you're crazy. There's one mountain lion in North America. You're going too far. You're a consummate, you're what we call a splitter. You're splitting species up into too many things. And to prove the professional mammologist wrong, Roosevelt went to Colorado to Meeker Ranch when he was vice president, and he shot what we in the business call a series. He shot a series of mountain lions to demonstrate, typically you have one species in one locality. So if you go to one locality and you collect a series of specimens, you could show the range of natural variation that exists in that species. And you could see, he showed it, it's clear as day to Merriam. He's like, look, that big one at the top happened to have been the Boone and Crockett record mountain lion, and there were small ones. They're all different sizes, and they're all different little variations in the morphology of the skull. And he's like, this is just like you and I can be different. We're all humans in this room. We all look a little different. Same thing with the mountain lions. He did that with museum collections. He went and he got the evidence, and he put them in a collection, and those specimens are still there. And they're used by people who are answering other questions completely unrelated to that original question. And once they become part of the archive, anyone could use them for anything at all. Roosevelt avoided hunting when he was in the White House. Famously, his Mississippi bear hunt. This is the actual bear. So most people are familiar with the story. There was a wounded, they treed a bear, or brought a bear to bay, and in the cane brakes of Mississippi, and they stunned it by, his guide stunned it by bashing its skull like that, and then they said, okay, here's your bear, it's wounded, go ahead and shoot. And Roosevelt refused to shoot it. It was unsportsmanlike. But the specimen was humanely dispatched, and he insisted on that specimen coming to the Smithsonian, where it still is, and that's it. And you could, I've seen CAT scan that thing, and someday I'm going to write a little paper on it. But it's one of the few specimens that we have of a black bear from Mississippi. No one else thought to collect them. And so years ago, when we had some wildlife biologists coming through that were restoring populations in Mississippi, they needed to know something about the genetic structure of black bears before they were largely extirpated. And what did we do? We went to Roosevelt's specimen, and we took a little DNA sample, and we were able to analyze what you should expect to see in the way of genetic diversity in these species. So they continue to have real value. But his hunts generated too much negative attention. He didn't do much hunting when he was in the office, and we should be grateful that he did, because he focused on his conservation record, which 230 million acres protected. And oftentimes, this is like the climax of Roosevelt's career as a conservationist. 230 million acres, 55 wildlife refuges, 5 national parks. But I don't think it should really end there. I don't mean to lessen the impact of that, but Roosevelt was equally committed to natural history collections, and he knew that museum specimens would one day prove to be essential to restoring and sustaining these same protected lands. Every one of those specimens is data, it's information. If you're making decisions on how to manage protected lands without data, you're guessing. And Roosevelt knew that, and that's why I think he was so dedicated throughout his life to collecting scientific data in the form of these specimens. If you don't believe me, if you don't believe that he was dedicated, here's another famous story. On the right, he loved voles, Roosevelt. He was constantly collecting voles. The vole is a dried rodent skin. The one on the bottom is from 1870, and he was just a kid. That was in his boyhood collection. The one at the top is the only mammal specimen that has ever been collected by a sitting US president. And it's a famous story. I call it the presidential vole. And people come to visit me at the museum, and it's like, you know, Michael comes and other people, Clay comes, and it's like okay, let's see the presidential vole. But he was touring Yellowstone on his famous Whistle Stop tour in 1903, and he was with John Burroughs, and he swore he wouldn't collect anything, he wouldn't hunt anything, he wouldn't collect, but something caught his eye when he was on this sleigh going through the geyser region, and it was a vole scurrying across the snow, and he famously jumped off the sleigh with his hat and captured it, and missed lunch because he was preparing the specimen, and he sent it to Merriam, and it's still in the Smithsonian. And it's not in the Smithsonian because Roosevelt was famous. It's there because it's a vole. And Roosevelt was like no different than any other collector that would have sent things in for us. All right. After leaving the White House, Roosevelt was arguably the most famous person in the world. He could have done almost anything he wanted to do. And what did he decide to do? He decided to lead a year-long scientific expedition for the Smithsonian. Trailing through Kenya, Uganda, and parts of South Sudan, he was joined by three Smithsonian scientists who were tasked with studying the smaller mammals. So Roosevelt and his son Kermit had agreed that they would focus on collecting large mammals for science, and the three Smithsonian scientists collected smaller mammals, they collected birds, and they also collected plants. They brought plant press, and they collected a lot of botanical specimens. And it's interesting because Roosevelt went west on the railroads, and he saw what happened with the advent of railroads and how it just led to the decimation of everything out west. And you could see the same thing happening in East Africa. These railroads were new, and you could see the track that they followed through East Africa. And he knew the same thing was going to happen, and he wanted to get in and document what that place was like before civilization advanced on those railroads. Again, the expedition is often unfairly dismissed as a mere hunting trip, but the truth is that Roosevelt collected big game for science. So that's one of the hippos that Roosevelt collected. Yes, I know it's a little graphic, but it is what it is. It's the work, it's the scientific work that we do. And they're preparing that hippo specimen. Those hippos on the right are actually in the American Museum of Natural History in that attic that I told you about. They weren't collected by Roosevelt, they were collected by other collectors. But I use this picture because the American Museum had their hippos out on shelves and it made for a nicer picture. Smithsonian, we keep them in individual cases, so I couldn't get a good panoramic shot like that. But you get the idea, is he was putting all of these specimens into a collection where they could be used. So how many animals did they kill? Well, together, TR and Kermit, they shot 512 big game animals. You could look in the appendix of his book, African Game Trails, and you could see their full tally. But nearly every one of those became a specimen, and it was just a tiny fraction of try to guess, of the 5,000 mammals total that they collected. And of the 21,000 specimens, when you include all the plants and the fish and even some fossils they collected. The expedition resulted in the descriptions of dozens of new species. When you see a red tag on a specimen, it means that that specimen was used to describe something new for the first time. Dozens of things were discovered and described for the first time as a result of the Roosevelt expedition. Roosevelt, an avid writer since since childhood, wrote two books. The famous one is African Game Trails, which I always think he wrote that narrative account because he wanted to preserve something of the memory of unfenced Africa. He knew the time would come when people wouldn't believe that you could just run around with a gun and shoot these things. It was a real wild time. But the other is Life Histories of African Game Mammals, which was a real gem of a natural history account, which Roosevelt wrote with one of the Smithsonian naturalists. They collected specimens for exhibit, Smithsonian taxidermy shop in 1910, and a finished lion diorama on exhibit. His expedition, 1909, 1910 expedition, really kind of put this kind of scientific collecting on the map. I think it gave us a 100-year boost. I don't think I would have been able to do the expeditions that I did were it not for the fact that Roosevelt really sort of supercharged this idea of getting out on expeditions and collecting specimens. That's the Smithsonian being built up in 1910. That's the Natural History Museum. There's the American Museum. Both museums Roosevelt was involved with, both of them. I worked for these two places, still work for them, 35 years. Expanding to house all of these collections, and not just from Roosevelt. Perhaps most controversial was Roosevelt's decision to collect specimens of the northern white rhino. And I should explain that at that time of Roosevelt's expedition, the white rhino was known only from southern Africa. And it was described in the early 1800s, 1817. And by the time Roosevelt was going to Africa, it was down to just like 5 individuals. The species was almost extinct. Those 5 individuals lived on a game farm in South Africa. And then, wouldn't you know it, in 1900, explorers going out discovered a second population of white rhinos way up in the north in Uganda and South Sudan. That's the northern white rhino. And Roosevelt went there on his expedition in part because he wanted to study this species and collect specimens. Roosevelt knew that the fate of the species was, yes, they found this new population. Roosevelt estimated there must have been, he estimated about 50. He collected 14 for the museum. He really wrestled with it out loud. He wrote down, he's like, this species is probably going to go extinct. And he said, it just seems like I have to collect some specimens for posterity. He collected 14. He collected 3 for taxidermy in the American Museum so they could go on exhibit, which is where that is. He collected 2 to go on exhibit at the Smithsonian. He collected 3 more to go into the scientific collections. And he picked up the skulls of weathered skulls of several more that he found. But we should be grateful that Roosevelt did this because he didn't just put them on a shelf and walk away. They did a major study. That on the left is a major monograph, a study of their specimens on the white rhino. And what Roosevelt determined, working with Edmund Heller, who was one of the naturalists on the expedition, is that these 2 populations were being called different kinds of white rhinos. And he's like, we're looking at these things. They were described from just a handful of specimens. He collected these 14 more, and he's looking at them, and he's saying, the differences between these 2 populations in the south and up north in Uganda are so slight that, well, there's the quote at the top, examination of the series of specimens we brought home shows that there is only the slightest distinction between these 2 widely separated groups of white rhinos. What that means is that you could use one population to repopulate the other. And this is exactly what's happening now. There are efforts underway. So I just got back from Uganda 4 weeks ago. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about the work that I'm doing with the Uganda Wildlife Authority that's working to reintroduce the white rhino to the northern part of their range at the site where Roosevelt originally studied them in 1910. It's a place called the Ajai Reserve, which is just a few kilometers from Roosevelt's camp. Roosevelt's camp, when he did his expedition and studied these rhinos, is to this day called Rhino Camp. He put the place on the map. It didn't exist until he camped there, And then people just hung around, and it turned into a little town. It turns out to be the world's largest refugee camp now. But nearby is the Ajayi Reserve. And that picture on the right is from a nearby game farm where they've transplanted southern white rhinos up to this old sort of cattle ranch. It's a place called Ziwa. There are 50 rhinos there. They're just waiting to reintroduce them to the original part of their range. What's the problem? Why can't we just put them where they're supposed to be? Well, unfortunately, rhinos are grazers. They're like 2-ton lawnmowers. And I went to Ziwa last year, and we got pretty close to some of these guys, and they're just gobbling up just bales of grass. They're ecosystem engineers. Once you remove the rhinos, once they're extirpated, that original habitat had turned into scrubland because you didn't have the rhinoceros there constantly. What was the quote from earlier today? It's grasslands are damage dependent, right? They're damage dependent. You need whether it's fire or whether it's grazing, you need something to maintain that grassland. Well, the problem is when the northern white rhino eventually, and Roosevelt didn't make them extinct, they hung on for a few more decades. It was really only in the Idi Amin regime in the many decades later when they finally were extirpated. But unfortunately, the land is completely overgrown with brush, and it first needs to be returned to savanna. And that's what the Uganda Wildlife Authority is doing, is they're physically going in, hiring people with machetes to clear and burn the land so that we could get it back to grassland. Now, that can't be your strategy forever. You can't just hire people with machetes to maintain grassland. What you need to do is you need to restore the original fauna that was there that maintained that grassland naturally. And that original fauna included the white rhino, but equally importantly, it included rodents. What rodents were there? We don't know. Well, we do know. We do know because the Roosevelt expedition was there in 1910. And these are actual scientific specimens collected by the Roosevelt expedition in 1910. I just put up 3 of them, opened the drawers, across the hall from my office at the Smithsonian. Okay, let's get some striped grass mice. There are dozens of different species. They're all obscure. They're defining characteristics. There really aren't any field guides that could help you identify these. Only specialists can tell them apart. There's some shrews in the middle. They're all from rhino camp. They were there for 4 weeks, and they collected just about 400 individual specimens of small mammals, and representing about 30 different species, which you need to be living on that site to have a healthy savanna ecosystem. So we went back there, Smithsonian went back, 3 naturalists, myself, my boss, Melissa Hawkins, and my associate, Megan Vieira, went back, fulfilled the same role that Roosevelt's naturalists did. We spent 4 weeks there, and we collected specimens. We didn't have guns, but we had a lot of traps, and we had a lot of nets, and we got about 400 specimens, documenting about 30 species. So I'm running a little short on time, but I'm almost done. Just to go through the methods, there's me at the upper right preparing a specimen, collecting data, collecting tissue samples, doing our disease surveillance. There's Megan at the bottom right taking a epimorphine bat out of a net. The middle of the bottom is a net system that we use for catching the bats. Up above in the middle is a shrew, so we dig holes and we put these buckets in the ground and these shrews fall into them. And bottom left is a box trap called the Sherman trap that we tuck away. And you can see my rat trap at the top left there with a rodent that's, we were sampling arboreal species that are up on the vines. Our day was getting up before dawn, checking hundreds of traps, spending the middle of the day, dissecting them and collecting data, running out in the late afternoon to set up nets, and then just staying up all night catching bats and just doing it the same thing day after day after day after day with no sleep until you've replicated that survey that Roosevelt did. What did we find? Well, we got some great small mammals. The only thing is that the small mammal composition had completely changed. And it's because we have that record from Roosevelt from 114 years ago that we know what it should be. We know what should be there if we want to maintain a healthy grassland ecosystem that could support rhinos. We went and surveyed, it's called a resurvey. We went, we found all kinds of rodents. Some of them were the same, many of them were very different. And they were indicative of a brushland habitat, which is not surprising. But the thing that I want to drive home here is this kind of information is what you, if you don't have data, if you don't have the specimens, you're just guessing. If we could go and we could do these surveys, we know what Roosevelt did 100 years ago, we know what it should look like, we know what it looks like today. As we continue to modify that habitat, we could survey these specimens, and we'll know when we've got it right, when we get things back to the way they were when there was an intact fauna in place when Roosevelt surveyed it more than 100 years ago. So what are my concluding thoughts here? My concluding thoughts are that Roosevelt was a lifelong museum naturalist. He was one of us. We're an obscure bunch. There's not a lot of us. Most people don't know we exist. But again, it's my perspective. That's what I have to offer. I've studied Roosevelt. He was one of us. He was a museum naturalist that does this kind of work. And he championed the importance of scientific collections. He is often remembered for protecting land, but he was equally committed to surveying and sustainably managing these lands. And he knew that the scientific specimens housed in museums, he knew that they would be vital to the sustainable management of species and their habitats. He was a respected and experienced museum naturalist who recognized the importance of documenting the East African fauna as part of the Smithsonian Roosevelt expedition. And the results of his survey are, in fact, they are being used to inform the restoration of many of these same habitats so that we could bring back those white rhinos. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we do questions?
Just one or two. We just got a little bit of time.
Any questions?
I really appreciate your presentation. I've also read The Naturalist and really enjoyed it. In a separate book, I read somewhere that an example of how excellent a collector Tiara was how he preserved a puffin, and that they're very challenging animals to collect and make available for scientific collection, but it didn't go into much detail about why it was really challenging, and I was wondering if you could speak to that. I know you're mammals, not birds, so.
Yeah, but I can speak to that. So puffins are birds. You know, I could speak to my colleague. There's someone just like me in our bird department. But what I know, I've prepped a lot of birds too, and seabirds feed on fish, and so they tend to be really oily. They tend to be really, really oily, and that's not good for preservation, and you really have to scrape. There's something called a fat wheel, which we have at the museum, which is like a wire mesh wheel that spins like on a grinding machine, and then you put the skin up on that, and the fat goes spewing up against this board, and yeah, it's just the oil. It's just the oil and the grease. Thanks for the question.
I'm taking a bit of liberty here asking, but I mean, one of the things that we talk about in the classroom quite a bit is about the collection and squaring it with, I suppose, with our modern sense of ew, you know, like it's,
Yeah.
or shooting and hunting, and,
Right.
and that's changing too. And I think what your presentation did was give us an idea about the difference between science and perhaps those feelings. Do you teach at all, or how do you get across to young naturalists that this is essential, basically?
Well, when you asked me to come, Michael, I said this would be a great opportunity to talk about this stuff that we're doing and to get this message out. So I don't teach. You know, I'm at the Smithsonian, I'm caring for the collections, or I'm off on an expedition. And you know, I've got trips stacked up. You know, I'll be in Borneo later the year. I'll be back in Uganda. You know, we're looking at South America. I don't teach, but I do bring groups in and give them tours and present this messaging. And it's that slide that I put up, the one with me with the guns and the monkey and the pistol and the paca. And I was like, ooh, should I? And I said, I think I'm ready to put these up because it's collecting. Those are the tools that we use. And those were the tools Roosevelt used. And people need to know that, you know, we don't use guns a whole lot now. It's getting a little bit difficult politically, but that's the work. And, you know, if data is important to you, and if you think management decisions should be made based on the best scientific data available, then these kinds of collecting, it doesn't need to be overboard, but it is necessary. This is necessary, and it has to happen. So, yeah, try to get that message out as much as I can. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Darrin, for that fascinating talk. I want to make a couple closing remarks, and I also have a little bit of housekeeping, and we do have one more event tonight as well. But one of the things I've been struck with today is just how diverse the different topics we've heard about are today within this umbrella of TR and conservation and sustainability, because we've heard about land and animals and water and woods and the city and all of these different elements. And that's been really interesting to me to find the way that the pieces fit together. As a scholar, I find this to be such an enriching event to be able to hear these different perspectives in these different angles. So I want to take a moment just to thank all of our speakers today. Round of applause for them. So the next thing is I will bid adieu to our streaming audience. This will be the last event that is live streamed. We have a couple more things here for our in-person audience, but this will be the end for that. We thank you all for watching. This recording will be available as well for you. And we know there was a little bit of a glitch with the streaming as well. If you send me, William Hansard, an email, you've got that email. We've probably been in contact. We can make sure you get to see everything that went on that was recorded today. Our last event for